Well, good morning, all our participants, and a very warm welcome to Chulalongkorn University Language Institute International Research Webinar of 2020 under the theme of Exploring the Changing Frontiers of ELT Research. And today we're very honored to have with us this afternoon Associate Professor Dr. Christopher Jenks from Aalborg University of Denmark. So Dr. Jenks will be giving his talk on doing classroom discourse research in 2020 and beyond. Just before we start, let me just take this opportunity to very briefly introduce our speaker for this afternoon. Dr. Christopher Jenks is an associate professor at Aalborg University in Denmark. His research interests are in discourse analysis, global Englishes, translingualism, computer-mediated communication, and language pedagogy. Dr. Jenks has extensive English teaching and research experience in many countries around the world. He has given numerous plenary presentations at regional and international conferences and has published widely in top international journals. So please join me in welcoming our speaker for this afternoon, Dr. Jenks.
Thank you. Okay, so let me just share my screen and then we can begin. Okay. So hopefully everyone can see that. If you can't, then perhaps you can send a text in the chat function. So before I begin, I'd like to thank CULI for the invitation. It's a great honor to be giving a presentation on some of my research interests. Hopefully the attendees will find it of use and some value. I've been given about 60 minutes to give this presentation. I have about 45 slides, so there's a lot of information. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of scratch the surface on a number of different issues, and hopefully that will generate some discussion after my presentation. So the topic of my presentation is research in classroom discourse in 2000 and beyond. And the subtitle of this presentation is relevant because as we sit here in our respective homes, rooms, and office spaces, we're reminded of how crazy 2020 has been and the impact it will have on our personal and professional lives in the years to come. And I think this is a great opportunity to reflect on some of the opportunities and challenges that we have as language practitioners and scholars in doing research in ELT. Now, classroom discourse research is, of course, just one of many topics within English language teaching, but I think classroom discourse is somewhat unique in that most of our research operates within the classroom. So I think even if you're not a specialist in classroom discourse, or even if you're tangentially interested in classroom discourse, hopefully this presentation today will help you become inspired to do more classroom discourse research. So the basic organization of this presentation is somewhat simple. I have 4 questions that I'd like to explore. And I'm not going to be able to answer them in detail. And like I said, I'm going to be scratching the surface on a number of different issues, but hopefully these questions will help us not only better understand classroom discourse, but maybe in the future, begin incorporating it into our own professional and empirical practices. So the first question, why should we care? Why should we care about classroom discourse? Why is it important for us? As language practitioners and language researchers. What are the challenges? What are the challenges that existed 20 years ago? And what are the challenges today and beyond? Some of the challenges that we've faced in recent months because of the COVID situation are more or less challenges that we faced in previous years. Perhaps they're more amplified now, but some of the things I'm going to be discussing are the unique opportunities and challenges that we have in researching classroom discourse when the bulk of teaching and learning is being delivered online. The third question is, how do we move forward? How do we move forward knowing these challenges, knowing these opportunities? What are the things that we need to do as language practitioners and researchers in incorporating classroom discourse research to design better materials and to engage in research? And then finally, what are the opportunities that we can identify in making a contribution to the field, to the literature? How can we add to what has already been done in classroom discourse research? So 4 basic questions, a lot of information. So again, I'm gonna zoom through some of these slides, but hopefully we can have some time at the end of the presentation to discuss some of these issues and observations. So the first question, why should we care? And I'd like to begin this question with a set of pedagogical reasons why we should care about classroom discourse. Now, all of us are language practitioners, language teachers in some respect, right? So I think it's important to first begin with why should it matter to us as teachers? Why does classroom discourse matter to us as teachers? And of course, there are many reasons, many pedagogical reasons why we should care about classroom discourse, why we should care about what happens in the classroom. But because time is limited today, I just identified 4 that come to my mind immediately. And again, we can discuss additional reasons during the Q&A. So the first, let me just move something here. Okay, so the first reason, the first pedagogical reason that I'd like to briefly discuss is the importance of what teachers do and say. So classroom discourse research and our own anecdotal evidence in the classroom demonstrates that what we do as teachers, what we say in response to students, what we say during our lectures, during our explanations, have a profound impact on not only teaching, not only what we do in the classroom and how we do it, but also the ability of students to learn, right? Their ability to develop proficiency over weeks, over months, is closely related to what we do and what we say in the classroom. So I'm not going to make this a very theoretical presentation. So I'm not going to list any specific references or studies. But there are a number, hundreds of papers that have looked at the relationship between what teachers do and say and what students learn. And so as teachers, right, even if we're not going to be researching classroom discourse, we need to be aware that what we do has a profound impact on our students' ability to learn. Now, this is common sense. This is something that we know as teachers, as experienced teachers in the classroom. But what we often overlook is the fact that a closer examination of what we say and what we do, for example, response times, the time in which we give students to respond to some of our questions, is something that we often don't monitor, something that we don't actually know. So we know that we ask students questions, we know we give them some amount of time to provide answers, but we don't really know how much time we give them and whether or not that time is enough or whether that time is too long. And so again, even if we're not doing classroom discourse research, as teachers, as practitioners, we can be more cognizant of that response time. We can monitor it very easily. It doesn't require, engaging in long-term empirical research. And we can find out, in very simple terms, in sort of data-driven terms, what we say and what students do, and we can make adjustments accordingly. Okay, but the upshot is that we need to be more cognizant of what we do and say because it has a profound impact on students' learning. The second pedagogical reason is that DA, discourse analysis, is a tool to bring about change. So I mentioned response time and the ability to bring about change by just reflecting and closely monitoring our response time, right? Or the response time that we give students. So this is a very sort of practice-based form of discourse analysis. So discourse analysis is an umbrella term that people use to cover a number of different approaches and a number of different methodologies. But if you're doing a case study, or if you're doing action research, for example, then no one is expecting you to know how to do, for example, conversation analysis or critical discourse analysis. As teachers, as language practitioners, what we want is simply a tool that helps us become better teachers, a tool that helps students learn better, right? So we know both in empirical papers and in our own experiences in classrooms, when we are aware of the discourse, right? When we adopt discourse analytic tools, we can bring about change. We can identify discourse features, and we can make adjustments according to the data, according to our observations, right? So it's one thing to say, okay, maybe you have a team meeting with a bunch of teachers, and you say, well, I think students needs to be given more time to respond to our questions. I don't think that students have enough time in our classroom to think about some of the questions that we ask. Sort of raising that question in a team meeting may be effective. Students, your fellow colleagues may buy into that need. But if you have empirical evidence, if you have some type of observation or data that you can show them, then it helps bring about change, right? And again, I'm not suggesting that as language practitioners, right, if we're focused on teaching in the classroom, to go back to school and do a PhD, or to develop analytic skills over many months or many years. Discourse analysis can be learned and adopted very easily, and there are a number of books that tell you how you can apply discourse analysis in very simple ways to bring about change. Okay, the other important reason why we should care, the other important pedagogical reason why we should care about discourse analysis is that it can be used to develop ourselves as professionals, right? So if you are a in-service teacher, if you're training to be a teacher, for example, then we know that discourse analysis can help us become a better teacher. As I mentioned, in these past two slides, being cognizant of discourse helps us become better teachers. If we're teacher trainers, and I imagine that many of you attending this presentation are teacher trainers, and if you're thinking about tools and ways to help our students learn how to become teachers and learn how to become better teachers, then of course discourse analysis, classroom discourse research are very concrete ways to bring about change, to develop ourselves and our students into better teachers. And closely related to professional development is materials development. So in addition to being able to develop ourselves as better teachers, develop students into better teachers, we know that discourse analysis research can help us develop better materials, right? So we spend many hours, many days, many weeks, many months developing lessons, syllabi, and sometimes they work, sometimes they don't work. Sometimes students respond very well to our planned lessons, and other times they don't. And often as language practitioners, we don't have the time to sort of closely examine why things work and why things don't work. But we do understand that if we, again, adopt very basic discourse analytic tools, we can maybe better understand why some things work and why some things don't work. Is it because of response time? Is it because of the type of questions that we ask? Are we asking the wrong questions, right? There's been research that looks at referential questions and display questions. Does the teacher ask questions that she or he already knows the answer to? And will that have an impact on the students' motivation and ability to learn content, right? So there's a lot of literature on how classroom discourse research can provide a tool to develop better materials, better teaching and learning materials, right? So those are 4 very basic pedagogical reasons why we should care about classroom discourse research. Okay, I'm not sure why on my slide, if you can see that someone is drawing lines. I'm not sure if I can erase that, but there's some green lines on there. Hopefully someone can erase that. Okay, so in addition to the pedagogical reasons, we have empirical reasons as well. And again, this is not a comprehensive list. This is not a comprehensive list of the different reasons why we should care about classroom discourse research and engage in classroom discourse research. But I've identified 3 that come to mind, the 3 most immediate reasons why we should care about classroom discourse research. And I imagine that many of you, if not most of you, are interested in doing actual research and publishing your research. And some of these things I think should be of relevance to you. So the first, I think for me, the most important empirical reason why we should care about classroom discourse research is that it's a high impact area of research. Now, if you're working at a university now, if you're on some type of tenure track program where you're required to publish, to get a promotion, to retain your job, then we know that management wants us to publish papers that have impact, that generate citations, that generates interest and excitement. And if you look at databases, basic linguistic and language sciences databases, you can easily see that classroom discourse research has not only existed for many decades, but it has had a profound impact on a number of different areas of study. So like I said, classroom discourse research is one of many areas of ELT research, but it is an area of research that is relevant to most of what we do, because most of us are in classrooms, at least teaching something. So at the very least, classroom discourse research can have an impact on language practitioners, but potentially it can have an impact and it can generate interest in a number of different disciplines and fields of study. Okay, so it's a high impact area of research. If your employer, if your university requires you to engage in high impact research, then I would recommend exploring the possibility of doing classroom discourse research. Okay, and closely related to that is classroom discourse research, classroom discourse analysis, CDA, C-DA, is interdisciplinary and varied, right? So it's interdisciplinary in that when you look in the literature, classroom discourse research is often conducted by people working in psychology, education, applied linguistics, TESOL, English language teaching, anthropology, philosophy, a number of different areas of study, a number of different fields and disciplines are interested in what happens in the classroom, what happens, what happens discursively in the classroom. And that research is varied, right? It's varied. It's not only interdisciplinary, it's varied. So it's not only being conducted by people working in a number of disciplines, but the type of research that's being conducted varies, right? So in applied linguistics, for example, a lot of research looks at what teachers say and how that shapes students' learning. In anthropology, maybe they're looking, or even sociology, maybe they're looking at the larger social structures. Maybe they're looking at language policy and how that impacts classroom discourse, right? So in Thailand, for example, or we have some people from the Philippines. So what is the government saying about how English should be used in the classroom? And how does that influence what teachers do? And how does that influence what students do, right? So there are a number of ways that we can look at classroom discourse research. It doesn't have to be necessarily examining the interactional features. It doesn't have to be looking at the conversational features. It can be looking at the larger social structures, the larger political structures that shape how we teach and learn in classrooms, right? So again, I contend that even if you're not interested in doing classroom discourse research because you're interested in a different sort of sub-area of ELT, I imagine that there are opportunities to find overlap between your own interests and classroom discourse research. Excuse me. And the final empirical justification is discourse analysis is a flexible analytic tool. So I mentioned earlier that discourse analysis is an umbrella term that covers a number of different approaches and methodologies. And it can be something as rigorous and theoretical as conversation analysis, or it can be as simple as a teacher in the classroom writing down notes or making mental notes about what happens between the exchanges between herself and the students, right? So it doesn't have to, discourse analysis does not mean that you are engaging in heavy duty research. It can be quite basic and quite practice-based, right? So DA is flexible. It's a friendly analytic tool. You don't need to be scared of it. You don't need to think that it requires many years of study and practice. It's a very flexible analytic tool. And again, I won't go into detail about the different approaches and the different principles, but there are a number of handbooks on discourse analysis that you can refer to that can help you, that can point you in the right direction. Okay, so what I've done so far is I've identified some of the pedagogical and some of the empirical reasons why we should care about classroom discourse. So in addition to those reasons, as I mentioned in the beginning of my presentation, we live in a world where things are not quite as normal as they used to be. Most, if not of our, all of our teaching has been moved online. And what this has forced us to think about is not only how technology shapes teaching and learning, but it's forced us to reconceptualize what is classroom teaching and learning. What does it mean to be in a classroom? What does it mean to be a student? What does it mean to be a teacher in 2020? And what will it mean to be a teacher and a student in the classroom in the years to come, right? And so in subsequent years, what should we be thinking about? Why should we care? Why should we care about the classroom? Well, we know from personal experiences, we should care about the classroom. Just sort of setting aside discourse analysis, we should care about classroom discourse because this year, the latter half of last year, at least when I was working in Hong Kong, and in the future years, we have been forced to change how we approach teaching and learning, right? Whether we like it or not. Although I research, for example, online learning and classroom discourse research, as a teacher, as a language practitioner, I very much prefer to be in an actual classroom. I very much prefer to see people and to engage and to walk around and to, sort of be aware of spatial configurations within a physical classroom. So for me, it was quite challenging, and I'm sure for many of you, it's been quite challenging as well to understand how to teach better in the classroom. This is, I think, a very profound reason why we should care about classroom discourse research, because, hopefully I'm wrong, but I think in several years to come, this is going to be somewhat the norm. We are going to continue teaching in an online setting, even if things get better, even if there's a vaccine. I think, we have become slowly accustomed to online learning. And I think it's just going to be sort of a universal component of higher education. Maybe not, 100%, maybe it won't represent 100% of the teaching and learning in higher education, but I think even if things are better in the months and years to come, I think universities are going to at least need to have a backup plan. There needs to be a backup plan. So if something like this happens again, they need to be able to shift quickly onto or into online learning. And we've experienced in this past in this past academic year, that some universities were not equipped to do that. Some universities were not equipped well to make that transition. And as we experienced, some students complain, maybe many students complain about that transition. And so even if things get better, I imagine that schools, institutions, higher education institutions will have, as a backup plan, online learning as a mode of instructional delivery. Okay, so that is a profound reason why we should care about classroom discourse, but it's also a challenge. It's also one of the challenges that we need to address if we're going to be thinking about classroom teaching and learning and classroom discourse. Now, before I talk a little bit more about some of those newer challenges, I want to talk about some of the classic challenges, because maybe some of you are not experienced in classroom discourse research, maybe some of you are new to classroom discourse research. And so these are challenges that exist now, but there are also challenges that have existed for many decades. So as I mentioned before, classroom discourse research has existed for many decades. It's been conducted by people working in a number of disciplines. And what we've discovered over the years, what we've, maybe some of you have done classroom discourse research, right? Perhaps the most challenging aspect of doing any type of research in a classroom, whether it's discourse analytic oriented or whether it's focused on maybe linguistic features or whatever type of research you do, if it's in the classroom, often access is an issue. And what I mean by access is the ability as a researcher to go into a classroom and to collect data, to make observations, to record, to take pictures, right? Access is a very important challenge that we need to be aware of, right? So some of you are students and are not currently teaching. And if that's the case, then you need to think about, well, who do I know that is a teacher? Did I used to work at a school? Did I used to work at a university? And if so, who are the gatekeepers? Who are the people that can give me access to the school and that can give me access to the classroom? Right, so we need to be aware of access, because access is an important thing, and it's even more so now with a lot of learning online. So how do we gain access to an online classroom, right? If we're doing ethnography, for example, or if we're doing classroom observations, as a researcher, how do we attend that classroom? How do we gain access, and how do we make observations? So access is a very important thing. This is not unique to classroom discourse research, as many of you probably know. Access is something that we all need to deal with in doing ELT research, but it is especially challenging in classroom discourse research. How do we get access, right? So in addition to access, we also need to think about ethics. Ethics is something that is not universal, because I should say it's universal on one hand, in that most higher education universities require you to think about ethical procedures and principles, but it's also not universal in that every institution, every country, and every region will have a different set of expectations. But when you're doing research in the classroom, especially if it's a classroom of young learners, we need to be aware. We need to understand what we can and what we cannot do in the classroom in terms of research. Can we make video recordings? Can we ask students questions? Can we interview them, right? At what age is it appropriate to ask questions? So there are a number of ethical issues. Again, I'm not going to make this a theoretical presentation. I just want to sort of, plant the seed, so maybe some of you can start thinking about the different variables and aspects involved in doing research. But certainly ethics committees, ethical procedures will slow down your research at the very least. From my experience, ethics committees and following ethical procedures slows down the research process. So it's something to think about. If time is limited, if you don't think you can get access, then maybe classroom discourse research isn't the best area of study. But again, it's not unique to classroom discourse research. Any type of ELT research will be bound to some type of ethical expectation. Okay, as with the first two challenges, field work is not unique to classroom discourse research. Field work is something that we often do in ELT research. And what that means is we go into a classroom and we are aware of what's being taught. We're aware to some extent who the students are, what their abilities are, what their interests are, right? So field work is like ethnography, right? Even though we may not be doing ethnographic work in our research, we are all, to some extent, engaging in field work, in that all good research in ELT requires a general understanding of the context and setting in which we investigate. So in the classroom, we need to be aware of, you know, when the class starts, when the class ends, what the students are learning, what the teacher expects, what are the lesson plans, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of things that we could potentially observe and make notes of, but field work is definitely an added challenge in classroom discourse research, because there, you know, again, as a teacher and as students, we know from anecdotal experience that the classroom is complex. It's a complex space of teaching and learning, and there are potentially a number of different variables that we need to take into consideration. And so fieldwork allows us to do that, but it's also a challenge in that, you know, we need to make sense of what to collect, what to observe, and what to ignore. Okay. And the final classic challenge in doing classroom discourse research is understanding the sort of dichotomy between public and private. And what I mean by that is when we collect data, when we make observations for research purposes, we are often sharing it to another group of people. What becomes private and what becomes public is something that's related to ethics and ethic committees. And it's something that I don't want to go into detail, but I should note that especially in today's world where teaching and learning is mostly online, hopefully temporarily, we need to understand whether we are allowed to collect data. So if we, for example, deliver a class using online learning tools, and then we upload it onto YouTube, or we use a social media platform to engage in teaching and learning, or maybe if you're in Thailand, you're using Line, which is a popular social media sort of text messaging app. Are we allowed to use those text messages between ourselves and between the students? Is that public or is that private? Do we need to ask for permission, or is it assumed that if you're using social media that everything is public? There's a lot of different things that we need to take into consideration. Different social media platforms, different websites have different policies. So we need to be aware of that, right? So it's the public-private dichotomy is something that has existed for many years, but it's especially complex in today's world where technology and online learning have become more or less the norm. I mean, there are exceptions, but I think most regions and countries around the world are facing the same challenges when it comes to classrooms and online teaching and learning. Okay, so those are the classic challenges. Those are some of the things that we need to take into consideration, and certainly these aren't sort of new challenges. Or I shouldn't say that they're not invalid in today's world. They're still very much relevant. So although they're classic, they still have an impact on how we do research in today's ELT research. Okay, so some of the newer challenges that we need to think about, and I've mentioned some of these already, especially in the beginning of my presentation, classroom technologies. So again, you know, even if we look beyond, not beyond, but even if we look past 2020, if we think about the teaching and learning of 2015, the teaching and learning of 2018, classroom technologies have been slowly incorporated into most classrooms, into many classrooms. And so as we incorporate more technologies, as teachers, as we become more comfortable with using technologies, we also need to understand how these technologies influence what we do and what we say as teachers and also as students, right? So this is a very important challenge, and it's a very difficult challenge to address, because we know if we just look at the physical classroom, you know, the discourse that occurs within the physical classroom, within the traditional sort of physical classroom is exceptionally complex. Once we start adding different technologies, social media, online learning tools, we create different contexts, we create different contextual variables. And this requires us to be aware of different discourse levels and operating at different modes of communication. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes, but the basic point is the more technology that we incorporate into the classroom, the more complex the classroom gets. And again, this is maybe common sense, but this is something that we don't really think about too often, right? We think, okay, my students like Line or my students like YouTube. I'm just going to incorporate that into classroom and generate interest and generate interaction and participation, right? And so that as a pedagogical goal is sound, it's fine. As a researcher, we need to think about, well, what does that mean for me as someone that's collecting and observing discourse? It makes things exceptionally complex. So we need to be aware of that. So the more technologies that the teacher or that we incorporate into the classroom, the more complex things get as a researcher. Okay, emergent issues. I don't want to be, you know, a person of doom and gloom. I don't want to talk about all the bad things that have happened this year, but we do need to be aware. We do need to be aware of how the political, how the social climate changes what we do as teachers, changes what we do and what we can do as researchers, right? So every year there's an emergent issue, and these emergent issues they need not be as international and global as something like COVID. It can be something like, oh, this year Line is popular, next year YouTube is popular. Emergent issues can be anything, right? So this year, the emergent issue is COVID, online learning. So we need to be aware of that as teachers, right? Not just, oh, this is impacting us, but what are the opportunities? What are the challenges? What can we do to exploit this? What can we do to maximize the situation or to make the most of the situation, right? I mentioned before that I initially had a difficult time making that transition because I really like to be in the classroom. As the months have gone by, I've been able to identify different ways of making myself comfortable and also maybe better addressing what students need as well. And so it takes time, right? So it takes time. But these issues, these challenges that we face as teachers also represents empirical opportunities. So they're not just challenges, but they're also opportunities as well. Okay, let me just check the time. So in addition to interdisciplinarity being a reason why we should care about classroom discourse, it's also a challenge. It's a challenge because, like many aspects of ELT research, there's not a lot of collaboration between different ways of thinking, right? So I think about second language acquisition research, for example. You have, researchers that are more inclined to follow social theories, and then you have researchers that are more inclined to follow like psychological theories, for example. And so for many decades, in second language acquisition, right, which is a profound, influential aspect of ELT research, have not communicated with each other. In fact, there's been a lot of debates and a lot of contention between those two schools of thought. And so this is a huge challenge, right? So it's a huge challenge to classroom discourse research. It's a huge challenge to ELT research. How do we make the most of the different ways of thinking about research? I think in order to make an impact in today's world, both as a teacher and as a researcher, we need to be able to better communicate across different schools of thought. We need to be able to better communicate across different ways of thinking about the world, different ways of thinking about teaching and learning. And so this is not some sort of, hippie kumbaya, let's all hold hands together sort of moment. This is a real empirical challenge, right? So, over the years, we become accustomed to think about one way of thinking about classroom discourse, become accustomed to think about one way of doing teaching and learning. And it's very easy to be set in our ways, right? And so I think the biggest challenge in future years is, and this is not just classroom discourse research, this is ELT research in general, is to become more interdisciplinary. How do we work with other people with different viewpoints? Because if any of you are doing research now, you should be aware that the literature is becoming saturated. Although there are many opportunities to do new and exciting research, a lot of research is just building on existing research, right? So it's a lot of research is becoming saturated. So I think for me, what's exciting in the future years to come is research that incorporates multiple perspectives, right? More collaboration, more interdisciplinary research. I think this is both a challenge, a huge challenge, but also an exciting opportunity. Okay. Oh, there's something in my water. Okay, so what I've done now is I've discussed some of the reasons why we should care about classroom discourse research, some of the empirical reasons, some of the pedagogical reasons, and I've just talked about some of the challenges. What are the challenges that we face? There are a number of challenges, as with the reasons why we should care about classroom discourse. The challenges that I've identified in this presentation are not a comprehensive list of the things that we need to be mindful of. It's certainly some of the more important ones, but it's not all of them, right? So I don't want to, I want to just make sure that you are aware that there are other things that we need to be thinking about. But again, because time is limited, I don't want to belabor the point. I don't want to talk about too many opportunities. I want to talk about some of the exciting things that we can do moving forward in classroom discourse research. So if you're a student in a PhD program, for example, what are some of the things that you can think about that can make a contribution to the literature, right? So what are the research gaps? What are some of the limitations? And what are some of the things that we can do to move the field forward? So classroom discourse research in particular, ELT research in general. And so I struggled to come up with a good word for the slide. The best that I can do with the time that I had was, or I should say, is solution or solutions. So, I mean, solutions it's a strong word. So I don't want to sort of express that these are like things that we can do easily and things that will fix things easily. But these are just some of the things that I think that we can think about in moving the literature forward. Okay, again, if you are a researcher or if you're a PhD student or an MA student, if you're asking yourself, how can I make a contribution to the literature? These are some of the things that you can do, right? Establish a foundation, be flexible and interdisciplinary, take a broad view of discourse. And I think, again, this is not unique to classroom discourse research. I think as an ELT researcher, we need to just be more what's the word I'm looking for? More egalitarian and more open to the ideal that teaching and learning operates at different levels of discourse. And we need to be able to contend with context and setting. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes, but I think for me, this is a very important issue. It's a very classic issue, but it's a very important issue because often we, as researchers, we think about the setting, but we neglect the context or vice versa. We're focused so much on the context that we lose sight on the setting. And these solutions, a lot of them overlap. They're all somewhat related to each other, and doing one will help you achieve another. And hopefully that will become clear in a few minutes. Okay, so the first thing is establish a foundation. So what do I mean by that? When we think about the classroom, right? And this is just one image to show you, to sort of illustrate what a classroom can look like. And certainly this is not the only, Maybe some classrooms are bigger, maybe some classrooms are smaller. Maybe some classrooms don't have any technology. Maybe some classrooms have more technology. But if you look at a classroom like this is not unique, right? We're, you know, as teachers, as researchers, when we look at a picture like this, we're not startled, we're not surprised, right? This is somewhat normal. This is a type of classroom that I often find myself in, right? Students are sitting maybe in circles, maybe in, you know, in sort of separate desks. Some of them have computers, some of them don't. Some of them have notebooks, some of them don't. But as a researcher and as a teacher, we look at the classroom and we think, okay, I see faces, I see bodies, I hear interaction, I'm interacting with students, I'm saying things, I'm writing things down on the board, right? These are all different sort of lenses that we can wear when we're trying to understand this complex space of teaching and learning. And so what I mean by taking a broad view of this, establishing a foundation, is when we look at a classroom like this, we need to think about not only what we see as a teacher and what we hear as a teacher and what we do as a teacher, what I call discourse actions, right? The things that we see, the things that we hear, the things that we do in the classroom, the things that we immediately see. In addition to those things, we need to also be aware that other things happening outside of the classroom, maybe at the school, maybe at someone's home, maybe in the country, or maybe worldwide, like COVID. Things happen outside of the classroom that we don't see immediately that also shape the classroom, that also shape classroom discourse, that also shape classroom teaching and learning. So when we establish a foundation, what I mean by that is we need to move beyond this tradition of being specialized in one particular area, right? Being specialized in critical discourse analysis, being specialized in conversation analysis, being specialized in sociolinguistics, or in a particular area of ELT, right? I think for me, in order to move ELT research forward, we need to establish foundation. We need to be not necessarily generalists, but we need to be aware of different ways of doing research. And this is related to being interdisciplinary as well, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. But establishing a foundation, I think, is the #1 thing that we need to do. And it's the first thing that we need to do. So in order to be interdisciplinary, in order to identify new and exciting areas of research, we need to be able to understand different ways of thinking about the world. And one way that we can do that within classroom discourse research is to look at the classroom as operating not only as discourse actions, again, what we see, what we do, and what students see and what they do, but also the larger discourse structures, right? So there's discourse structures shape discourse actions. Those discourse actions shape discourse structures. We need to look at both. Traditionally, classroom discourse research, ELT researchers have only looked at one and neglected the other. Okay, and related, be flexible and be interdisciplinary. We can't be interdisciplinary and flexible without establishing a foundation. And when we're thinking about classroom discourse research, in the context of classroom discourse research, you know, we think about the online learning that we've all been engaging in. And we look at a very familiar screen where we see some faces, maybe we see some pictures of faces, maybe we see some chats. If we're in this classroom, we would hear and maybe we would see different things, right? So when we're looking at the classroom, we're looking at the online classroom as well, we know that there are many ways of understanding this situation. There are many ways of approaching this classroom, right? Do we focus on what is being said? Do we focus on the faces? Do we focus on the text messages? Or do we focus on how teachers manage different modes of communication between, for example, text and the spoken mode, right? And so when we're flexible and interdisciplinary, we're better able to understand not just one aspect of classroom discourse, but many aspects, okay? And so again, this requires us to be, to establish a foundation. We need to have a broad foundation in order to be interdisciplinary, in order to understand this complex space, especially in online settings, when there are different modes of communication, when there are different modalities of discourse. right? And so, you know, this is not to scare you or to sort of overwhelm you, but it's just to show you some of the different approaches that you can adopt in classroom discourse research, some of the different approaches to discourse analysis, some of the different tools that you can use to understand discourse. And, you know, again, you can refer to any handbook of discourse analysis or classroom discourse, and you can see how these different approaches and methodologies operate. But the point in showing you these different methodologies, these different approaches to discourse, is to demonstrate that there's a lot of ways of understanding classroom discourse, and it doesn't really help us to focus on just one of them. So again, traditionally in our area of study, we have just picked one and neglected everything else. And so what I'm saying is we don't need to learn all of these different approaches, but we should certainly be aware of more than one, maybe a few, maybe more than a few. I mean, it's up to you, but we need to be able to look at these different approaches to understand how they're used and to potentially incorporate that into our own research, into maybe even our own teaching as well. Okay, the other thing that I want to mention is this idea of taking a broad view of discourse. So in addition to establishing a foundation, which allows us to be flexible and be interdisciplinary and to understand a number of different research areas, we need to take a broad view of discourse. So again, when we think, we close our eyes, we think about the classroom, when we close our eyes and think about these past months and how we've been teaching, how we've been learning in online setting, we know that, again, especially in online settings, that that discourse operates at different levels, that there are different levels of discourse, that there are different modes of discourse, there are different modes of communication, right? So maybe some of your students are in a public space. Maybe they're on, you know, using public transportation on their way home, on their way to their office, and they're logged into their Zoom classroom meeting. Or maybe you're, you know, in your office and all of your students are at home. And maybe your teaching is largely spoken communication, but maybe most of the communication that the students are engaged in the classroom is text-based. You know, when I was teaching my previous place of employment was Hong Kong. You know, this past semester when I was teaching in Hong Kong, I would either be on video or audio, and I would be speaking. And so the students would see me, but very rarely would they communicate in the same mode of communication. They would often just text me questions and communicate using the chat function. So we know that in today's world, in today's online world, that the classroom is not equal in terms of the types of discourse that operates and who is managing that discourse. So especially in today's online world, we need to take a broad view of discourse, because we know that it's not like in previous months and in previous years in the traditional classroom, where maybe the main mode of communication is speaking, or maybe the main mode of communication is speaking or writing, and all of the students and the teacher are engaged in that mode of communication. And in online environments, we know that discourse, again, operates at different levels and across different modes of communication. And so we look at this, we look at, okay, as a teacher and also as a researcher, the things that we say and the things that we do, especially in online settings, operates at different levels and across different modes of communication and across different tasks, right? So discourse in an online classroom can occur within and outside of classrooms. We think about discourse actions, we think about discourse structures, right? So I showed you in the first issue, establishing a foundation, right? So when we establish a foundation, we need to understand the classroom as discourse actions and discourse structures. We also know that discourse operates across time and space. In an online classroom, again, some of our students may be in public spaces. Maybe we're in a public space. Maybe our students are at home. Maybe they're in an office, maybe we're at home, or maybe we're at an office. Maybe the communication is asynchronous. Maybe our teaching and learning is on a discussion forum. So we know that discourse operates across different time and spaces, especially in online spaces. So we need to be able to reconcile that. We need to be able to identify and understand that. And then we also need to understand that discourse operates across different modes of communication. I mentioned my experience teaching in Hong Kong. Students are texting and I'm speaking, right? So we have two different modes of communication operating at the same time. And then we also know from anecdotal evidence, either as a teacher or as a student, but perhaps mostly as a student, that discourse can operate across different tasks, right? So in today's world, we can't live without our phones, right? Like not just our students, but ourselves. And we know from personal experiences, both as students and as teachers, that more often than not, the students are going to be checking their phone, checking the time, checking whether their boyfriend or girlfriend has texted them, checking, Instagram, checking Facebook or whatever. And so that's an extreme example. Maybe they're also talking to each other to help each other with the learning material as the teacher is teaching. But the point is that discourse operates across different tasks. It's not, so what we do in the classroom is not just teaching and learning, and it's not just related to what the teacher is saying and doing. It can be related to a number of different things, right? Maybe the student is using a dictionary on the phone. Maybe the student is toggling between a Zoom window and a dictionary window on the computer, right? So we know that they're different tasks. And these are things that we need to be able to better understand. Right. And the things that I'm talking about now, I mean, they may seem straightforward, but if you look in the literature, again, the tradition has been to look at just one level of discourse or one mode of communication or one task. The challenge in moving forward is to be able to understand at least two or more of these and how they operate at the same time. Okay. It's almost been an hour, so let me just speed things up just a little bit more. Okay, so context and setting. As I said before, and related to the previous slide, the tradition has been to focus on one and to neglect the other, right? So when you think about establishing a foundation, you think about this slide, for example, right? The tradition has been to look at the classroom as a setting, but not to focus on the context, the discourse actions, right? Or to focus on the discourse actions. Conversation analysts, for example, are notoriously bad at looking just at the interactional context, but not focusing on the larger setting, right? So the tradition in classroom discourse research, the tradition in ELT research indeed, has been to look at context and to neglect setting or vice versa. I'll skip that because of time. But what I'm saying is as researchers, as classroom researchers, as classroom discourse researchers, we need to be able to understand the different levels of context and the different types of setting that can have an impact on the teaching and learning, that can have an impact on how we do research, right? We have instructional context, social context. Again, social context could be something like language policy. Does the country have a colonial past? Does the country have a long history of learning and using English, et cetera, et cetera? There are many different contextual levels, many different types of setting that we need to contend with. Because of time, and again, I wasn't going to talk about these in detail. I just want to plant the seed and to demonstrate that the classroom is complex and that we need to better understand it by being flexible, establishing a foundation, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so I've talked about why we should care about classroom discourse. I talked about what the challenges are. I talked about how we move forward. What are some of the opportunities? Since these opportunities overlap with how we move forward, but I think it's important to look at it at from a slightly different perspective. Okay, so rather than just, well, let me see. Okay, I think I still have a few more. I'll just try to fly through these really quickly because I prefer to have time for Q&A and to have a discussion. Okay, so 3 critical areas that we can focus on. I'm happy to distribute this slide as well. I think this presentation is being recorded, so you can always go back. But if any of you want the slides, I can give them to May or to someone else, and you can distribute them to the attendees, because you know, some of these slides I'm just zooming by, and it would be maybe useful to have the slides as they're watching the video recording of this presentation. Anyway, so 3 critical areas that we should take into consideration when we're thinking about opportunities in ELT research in general and classroom discourse research in particular. The first is keeping pace with technology, right? As language practitioners, as teachers, we need to understand how our students are using technology in order to maximize teaching and learning in the classroom. We also need to be able to keep pace with technology, because there may be a tool, there may be a platform, there may be an application that we can use to make our lives easier and to make the students' experiences more enjoyable and more developmentally effective, right? So technology is very important. We need to embrace it, especially in 2020 and in particular beyond. We know that technology, we know that online learning is going to be more of the norm rather than the exception in subsequent years, in the years to come. We also, and this is something that's very important, especially if we're thinking about collaboration and interdisciplinary research, we need to think about new ways of presenting findings, and we need to also maximize the ways in which we disseminate our research. So how can we do impactful research in classroom discourse research that speaks to not only researchers, but also language practitioners? How do I, for example, as a classroom discourse researcher, engage in interesting and exciting research that not only excites researchers, but also can potentially have an impact on language teachers, on practitioners in the classroom? This is, for me, a very important thing in moving the field forward, right? Discussing our research beyond academic circles. So I talked about keeping pace with technology very quickly, embracing technology, working with IT software engineers. So this relates to interdisciplinarity. How can we maximize what it already exists, right? Can we develop an app that can suit our students' particular needs? Can we develop a software program that can better capture the complexity that is classroom discourse? Can we learn from students, right? We're often reluctant to learn from students, but what are students doing with technology, and how can we incorporate that into the classroom? And you know, as researchers, we often lose sight of what is happening on the ground. So how do we as researchers go into the classroom and collaborate with teachers and learn from teachers? Because maybe they're doing new and exciting things with technology that we can incorporate into our own research, that we can better understand for our own research purposes, that's mutually beneficial. Okay, I talked about new ways of presenting our findings, right? How do we present findings that move beyond the manuscript, right? So publications are often manuscript focused. You have, 5,000, 9,000 words, we have text, we have still images, we have transcripts, but is this the best way to disseminate our information? Is this the best way to disseminate our findings, given how technology is advancing, right? Other reasons right there, I'm not going to go into detail about them. Greater accessibility. If we as a profession, as ELT professionals, as language practitioners are going to make an impact in the years to come, again, we need to speak to people beyond academic circles. How do we as researchers talk to teachers that are focused on becoming better teachers, that are focused on their students' learning? We need to have open journals. We need to have our data available online, so students and so teacher trainers and so in-service teachers can have access to them to develop professionally, to develop better materials, right? How can we maximize video sharing websites for teaching and learning? How do we use YouTube? How do we use Vimeo? How do we use different social media applications and platforms to engage in teaching and learning, right? So research and teaching need not be limited to one space. We should be thinking about the different online technologies that we can use. And related to the first or the previous, data sharing, how can we collaborate with teachers? How do we better create collaborations between researchers and language practitioners, right? So there are a lot of things that we need to think about in terms of opportunities, things we need to think about in terms of moving the field forward. And so the very last slide, so I'm 65 minutes into my presentation. The very last slide that I want to end with is, I talked about a number of different issues that we need to care about, a number of different aspects that we need to think about. Now, this is my sort of shameless plug for my own research, but I think if any of you are interested in some of the things I've discussed, they come from this book. And this book was written for people that are interested in doing classroom research according to some of the principles that I've just identified. So do I want to become a classroom discourse researcher? Taking a broad view of discourse, establishing a foundation, and being more interdisciplinary. I think this book is one, perhaps, of several books that you can use. But again, because this is my presentation, I'm going to shamelessly plug in my book. If you're interested in any other books that may help you, I'm happy to share those. And again, before I end, remember, I'm happy to distribute these slides because the last few slides I rushed through. And also the video recording is online too. So if any of you have any questions, then I'm happy to answer them. So again, thank you for CULI, for the invitation. Thank you for the attendees for listening patiently through my presentation. I try to make it 60 minutes. It's more like 65 minutes. So apologies for that. But I'll stop talking and I'll let the MC or the MC step in and maybe moderate the Q&A. Maybe I should stop the sharing too, right?
It's fine. Right, well, thank you very much, Dr. Jenks, for your talk, and we've learned a lot about discourse analysis, especially in the classroom context. I'm sure we have a few questions from participants, but just to give you some breaks, after you've been talking for almost an hour, shall I just ask for a group photo first before we move on to the Q&A session? Okay. So can I just ask everyone to switch on their camera, and then we can all take group photo together? Thank you.
So did you say, is it better if I stop sharing? Is it better if I stop sharing? Probably?
Yes, please.
Okay. Where am I? Stop sharing. No, okay.
I think I just people taking the group picture, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Are you ready? Okay, the first screen, 1, 2, 3. Okay. You don't know what picture you'll be in, so you have to smile all the time. Okay, all right. So the second, cheese. Okay. Number 3, 1, 2, 3. Okay, number 4, 1, 2, 3. And number, okay, we have 4 screens, so we are done. Thank you very much, everyone. Thanks for joining us.
And I believe that we have some questions from the participants. So do you want to read the questions yourself, or I've listed some of the questions from the participants?
Okay, should I just check the chat thing, or?
I think we have
okay, so yeah, I'll go ahead and read that then. Okay, so we have one question from Ria. She says, what if you can only observe or get data from your own class? Is DA still viable? Yeah, so I think that's a very good question. So many teachers, many researchers only have access to the classroom. And for me, the classroom, your own classroom, is the best site of research because you know it intimately. You know the students, you know the materials, you have a long history with the students. And so for me, this makes the best research. For me, the best classroom discourse research is an investigation that incorporates ethnographic tools, right? And that, what I mean by that, that's not a fancy term. I'm not using it as a fancy term. What I mean by that is incorporating a deep and wide understanding of the classroom in your research. So for me, and maybe some people would disagree, but for me, the best site of research for classroom discourse research is your own classroom. Not only does it allow you to have better access, or easier access, I should say, but it provide you with the most information, because you're responsible for the teaching and the students are learning. So yeah, so it doesn't matter that you're doing your own class, you're researching your own class. DA is certainly a very useful tool for that research. Should I just keep going? Just read some of these questions? Okay. Another question from Pakon. What are some challenges teachers are facing in operating classrooms with different levels of discourse? Well, from a teaching perspective, for me, the biggest challenge is time. So as a teacher, how do I manage my teaching time, right? Focused on the students and their learning, and how do I manage my time as a researcher? The more levels of discourse that you incorporate into your research, the more time that it takes to understand. So I think the biggest challenge is time, and I guess resources as well. Time and resources. How do we incorporate the time? How do we maximize our time and resources in doing research? Now, I'm promoting the idea that we need to be interdisciplinary. I'm promoting the idea that we need to have a broad view of discourse, but it takes time. So I understand that realistically speaking, maybe some of our research is going to be single mode of discourse or related to a single mode of communication. And that's perfectly acceptable. So although I'm identifying these as opportunities, it doesn't mean that doing a single mode of communication research project will create bad results, right? You can still make a tremendous impact in the literature by looking at one mode of communication. I'm just looking beyond to 2020. I'm looking at, 5 years from now, 10 years from now. How do we move forward? What do we need to do? These are just some of the things that I think are important. So yeah, so that's a great question. I don't want to give you the impression that it has to be multimodal, that it has to be multidimensional. It can certainly be one mode of communication. Okay. Uniar, I'm sorry, I'm not proud of pronouncing your name right, from Indonesia. Most classes at my uni are conducted online due to the pandemic. How do we conduct a classroom discourse project knowing that we can't be in the class? So that's a very, very good question. If we're doing all online teaching and learning, how do we collect data? How do we make observations? One of the, I guess this is both a challenge and a strength. Online technology, so maybe, some of you aren't aware of technological developments. Indeed, I'm not, 100% up to speed when it comes to what are the most cutting edge technologies in terms of communication. But what I do know from both my own experiences as a teacher and a researcher, that generally speaking, teachers are way behind the technology curve. And there are a lot of programs out there now that will capture everything that's on your computer, the sounds, the images, and the videos. So it's very easy to record discourse in an online setting. What you do with that is a separate issue. But in terms of collecting the data, once you have access, there are a number of very, very good tools that we can use to capture the data. And in fact, on Zoom, if you record directly to the cloud, Zoom will not only record the discourse of the classroom, but it will create maybe a superficial representation of the discourse in a transcript form. So in other words, it'll create a transcript and a recording. So use technology, right? If you're teaching online, maximize the technology. There are a number of programs that you can use. If you're using Blackboard, for example, Ultra Collaborate will record the interaction for you. It won't create a transcript, but there are basic, they're called screen capturing programs that you can use to collect your data. Again, transcribing and making observations is a separate issue, but I think that's not an issue at all. Okay. We have a question from Pim. Do you think learner identities change when we learn English on? Yeah, so I think the question is related to how does the online environment change identities, change teaching and learning? So we know from our own experiences that teaching and learning changes depending on the mode of communication, depending on the setting, depending on the context, depending on the technology, et cetera, et cetera. We also know that context will ultimately shape our identities as well. So, you know, you think about something as classic as language anxiety, self-efficacy, you know, sort of classic psychological aspects of ELT research. You know, we know through some research in online settings that compares online to face-to-face teaching, that the mode of communication, the mode of teaching and learning will change how students approach teaching, how they approach learning. And some students will become more confident and therefore will perhaps create a different personality. And some people will stay the same. And it's hard to say what students will change and what students will stay the same, but we do know through research that identities will change. And I should note, finally, with regard to that question, that there is, although there is research in this area, it is something that needs to be further developed. So if you're interested in online learning, I think identities is a very fruitful area of research that you can investigate in future years. Okay. Did you want to say something? Did you want to say something, or no? I thought you wanted to say something. Okay. Dr. Jenks, what are some challenges you have found when conducting multimodal discourse analysis, especially in classrooms, suggestions? Okay, so I think if you're researching a traditional physical classroom, then the best way to approach data collection is to have multiple recording devices. And this is, you know, this depends on resources. Some people don't have the resources. Some universities don't have equipment to give their researchers and teachers. So I'm not expecting everyone to have multiple recording devices, but if you do, maximize those devices. If you have an iPad, a computer, a recording device, and maybe a phone, then see what you can do to use all of them to record the data, because multimodal aspects of multimodal discourse in the classroom is quite complex. And what we don't want to do is we don't want to record something and later find out that it's missing an important level or aspect of discourse. So if it's a physical classroom, try to use as many recording devices as you can. If it's, you know, as I mentioned a few questions ago, if it's online learning, then use online platforms, use technology to your benefit. There are many ways that you can collect data that captures everything, literally everything on your computer screen. And so the challenge though, once you have the data is sort of understanding how to piece everything together. This is where I think classroom ethnography really comes into play, because if you're an outsider, if you're a researcher coming into a new classroom, recording the interaction, then you're less likely to understand why the discourse in one context operates in one way and why it's doing, why discourse in a different context is operating in a different way. If it's your own classroom, you can better piece together the different levels of discourse into a coherent set of observations, right? So for me, the biggest challenge in doing multimodal research in the classroom is making sense of all the different aspects and levels of discourse.
Okay, so any more questions? If not, then I would like to take this opportunity to first of all thank Dr. Jenks for his insightful talk on, you know, conducting discourse analysis in ELT classrooms, and we've learned a lot about the benefits, the challenges, and also the opportunities of, you know, doing this research in our classroom, and I'm sure that it will be useful for our career as well. And also I would like to thank all our participants for joining our webinar conference. I hope you've you know, learned something useful from this session. And also, can I just kindly ask all of you to complete an evaluation form for this session, and after that there will be a link that you could, you know, proceed to get your certificate of attendance. So on behalf of CULI, again, thank you very much to you all for joining our conference, and we hope to see you again next year. Thank you.